The night my wife told me she would do anything to save our marriage, I was already 3 weeks into building the case that would end it. My name is Owen. I'm 44 years old, a commercial real estate attorney in Franklin, Tennessee, and I have spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to read contracts for what they don't say. The silence in an agreement, the clause that isn't there, the language that's been softened just enough to give someone room to maneuver, that's where the real meaning lives. I had learned this professionally before I understood it personally. By the time I understood it personally, I had been married to Serena for 14 years and our son Caden was 11 and the house we lived in had 6 bedrooms and a kitchen she had designed herself, and I had believed, with the comfortable certainty of a man who has never had reason to doubt, that I knew exactly what I had. Serena said it on a Tuesday evening in October, standing in the kitchen doorway in the soft light that came through the window above the sink. She had been crying, not theatrically, just the quiet kind, the kind that leaves no drama and a lot of damage. She reached for my hand across the counter and she said, "I'll do anything to fix us, Owen. I mean that. Anything." I covered her hand with mine. I looked at her face. I said, "I know you do." I did not tell her that 40 minutes earlier, while she was in the shower, I had read 17 text messages between her and a man named Derek on the phone she thought was locked. I did not tell her that I had been reading those messages, carefully and methodically, for 3 weeks. I said I know you do, and I meant something entirely different by it than she understood, and that was the last lie I ever told her, not out of cruelty, but out of precision. A good attorney never tips his hand before the moment is right. What she didn't know, standing there in the kitchen light asking me to believe her, was that I had already begun. Franklin is the kind of town where success has a specific aesthetic: wide driveways, well-maintained landscaping, the particular silence of streets where everyone has enough and nobody talks about it. We had lived there for 9 years, in a house that Serena had transformed from a builder-grade shell into something that appeared in a regional design magazine 2 years after we moved in. That appearance mattered to her. Not in a shallow way, she was genuinely talented, and the work was genuinely beautiful. But I understood, in retrospect, that the house had also become the clearest expression of who she was, because everything else had gradually compressed into the role of Owen's wife in a way that neither of us had addressed or acknowledged. At the time, I would not have described our marriage as troubled. I would have described it as settled, the specific comfort of 2 people who had built something durable together and no longer needed to negotiate every room. We had rhythms. I left early, came home late, made partner at 41, and assumed that financial security was a form of love language that translated without explanation. Serena ran the household, managed Caden's school schedule, grew her interior design practice from a side project into something that billed real money, and was admired at every dinner party we attended. What I didn't do, for years, was ask her how she was. Not "how was your day," that I managed. But the deeper question, the one that requires you to sit still long enough to hear an honest answer. I had been too busy building the structure of our life to notice what was happening inside it. Derek entered the picture through her work. He was a developer, mid-40s, newly divorced, commissioning the redesign of a vacation property in Leaper's Fork. Serena mentioned him the way she mentioned all her clients, briefly, professionally, in the context of project timelines and material choices. In September she mentioned he'd asked her to consult on a second property. In October she mentioned they'd had a site visit run long and she'd grabbed dinner nearby. I remember that dinner conversation, or rather, I remember the absence of weight in it. She told me about it casually, loading the dishwasher, and I said something like "sounds like a good client" and went back to the brief I'd brought home. That was my pattern. Frictionless acceptance of everything she offered, because examining it would have required me to stop working, and stopping work was something I had never quite learned to do. The first thing I noticed, genuinely noticed, not filed away, was the energy. Serena had always been composed. It was one of the things I'd admired about her when we met, a kind of self-contained steadiness that never required reassurance. In October that changed. She was animated in a way that didn't match the ordinary tempo of our life, laughing more easily, moving through the house with a restlessness, texting at odd hours with her phone angled away from me. I registered these changes the way you register a temperature shift, not as danger, just as difference. I told myself she had a demanding client. That the new project was exciting. That creative work produced a specific kind of energy that I, in my paper and argument profession, sometimes forgot was real. I told myself a lot of things in October. Caden asked me one evening, while I was helping him with a math worksheet at the kitchen table, "Dad, is Mom okay?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" He shrugged with the elaborate casualness of an 11-year-old who has something specific in mind. "She's just, on her phone a lot. More than usual." "She's got a big project," I said. He accepted that. He went back to his worksheet. But something in the question lodged somewhere low in my chest and stayed there, the way a splinter stays, not painful enough to demand attention, just present enough to notice whenever you move a certain way. Looking back, that was the moment I should have paid a different kind of attention. Not to Serena's phone, to Caden's face when he asked the question. Children encode the truth before adults are willing to say it. He wasn't asking about the phone. He was asking me if I'd noticed what he'd noticed, and whether I was going to do anything about it. I wasn't ready yet. But something had begun. November arrived cold and gray, and with it, a shift in Serena's behavior that was harder to explain away. She had always kept her phone charged on the kitchen counter overnight, a habit from Caden's early years, when she wanted to hear any nighttime notification without it waking me. In the first week of November, the charger moved to the bedroom nightstand. When I mentioned it offhandedly, she said the kitchen outlet had been flickering. I checked the outlet. It worked fine. I didn't say anything. I catalogued it. She began taking calls in the garage. I noticed this because Caden mentioned it, not accusingly, just observationally, the way kids report the world. "Mom was in the garage on the phone again when I got home." I asked her about it that evening. She said the acoustics in the house made calls difficult when I was on video conferences upstairs. It was a plausible explanation. I was on calls a lot. The timing tracked. What didn't track was a Thursday evening in mid-November. Serena had told me she was having dinner with a client, she'd mentioned it Monday, added it to the shared calendar, left at 6:30 in the green dress she reserved for professional dinners that mattered. I worked late, put Caden to bed, and was in my home office at 10:15 when I heard her car pull into the driveway. I went to the window. She was sitting in the car. Engine off. Phone in both hands, screen bright in the dark garage. She sat there for 11 minutes, I watched the clock, before she came inside. I was back at my desk when she walked past my office. She said goodnight through the half-open door. I said goodnight back. My voice was exactly normal. Inside something had gone very quiet, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a man who has just understood that he needs to think carefully before he moves. I want to be honest about what I did next and why I did it. I did not immediately go through her phone. Not because I had moral reservations. I was a lawyer, I understood evidence, and I understood that what I found would have to hold up not just legally but internally, in my own understanding of what had happened. I wanted to know the shape of the whole thing before I reacted to any part of it. That discipline was professional. It was also, I think, the last remaining expression of a personality that had spent 14 years preferring controlled knowledge to uncomfortable uncertainty. I called Vince the next morning. We'd been at law school together, made partner the same year, and he was the person I called when I needed to think out loud without the conversation going anywhere else. Hypothetically, I said, if a spouse were using a shared cloud backup account they didn't know their partner could access. Owen, Vince said. Hypothetically. A pause. Are you okay? Not entirely, I said. But I will be. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the shared Apple ID would sync message backups if she hasn't disabled it. But Owen, before you go down that road, are you sure you want to know? I thought about Serena sitting in the dark car for 11 minutes. I thought about Caden asking if his mother was okay. I've been sure for 2 weeks, I said. I just needed to admit it. The cloud backup yielded 3 weeks of messages. I will not reproduce them here in detail, because detail is not the point. The point is the architecture, the way the relationship between Serena and Derek had been constructed with such careful attention to plausibility that from the outside it would have read, to anyone not looking closely, as a professional relationship that had become a warm friendship. The language was calibrated. The affection was expressed in ways that could be reframed if necessary. Derek was not careless. Serena was not careless. But they were human, and humans get tired of being careful. The message that crystallized everything was from a Saturday 3 weeks prior, a day when Serena had told me she was visiting a fabric showroom in Nashville. The message to Derek read, Room 412 at the Fairlane. I told him showroom. He never checks. He never checks. I read that sentence 4 times. Not with anger, with recognition. She was right. I never checked. I had built an entire marriage on the foundation of not checking, and called it trust, and the difference between those two things was something I was only now, at 44, beginning to understand with any precision. I printed the relevant messages on the printer in my office, using paper from a ream I kept separate from the household supply. I created a folder on a drive that lived in my desk at work, not at home. I noted dates, cross-referenced them with our shared calendar, identified 7 occasions in the past 2 months where Serena's stated location did not match the behavioral evidence. The financial piece emerged in the second week. Serena ran her design practice through a business account I had set up for her 5 years ago, with a business credit card attached that I reviewed quarterly. When I pulled the most recent statements, not quarterly, but now, immediately, I found charges I couldn't place. A hotel charge in Nashville on the Saturday of the fabric showroom. A restaurant charge in Leaper's Fork on an evening she had said was a client dinner. 2 charges at a florist I didn't recognize. The florist bothered me most. Not because of the amount, it was $80. But because in 14 years, Serena had never bought herself flowers. She bought them for clients, for staging, for design presentations. She bought them for others. The idea that she was buying them for herself, or that someone was reimbursing her for flowers she'd received, that small domestic detail, $80, sat in my chest with a weight disproportionate to its size. Brooke called me that week. My younger sister, who had known Serena since before we married and had always maintained the careful neutrality of someone who loves both people in a couple and refuses to take sides in minor disputes. I ran into Serena at the Brentwood Whole Foods, she said. She seemed, I don't know. Off. Off how? A pause. She was on her phone the whole time. We talked for maybe 5 minutes and she was distracted for 4 of them. That's not like her. She's got a complicated project, I said. The explanation came out automatically, the same one I'd given Caden, worn smooth from use. Owen. Brooke's voice had a particular quality when she was working up to something. Is everything okay between you two? It will be, I said. Which was true. Just not in the way she understood. I sat with the evidence for 10 days before I decided on the approach. I was not going to confront Serena in a moment of emotion. I was not going to tip my hand incrementally, the way amateur negotiators do, showing one card at a time and allowing the other party to adjust their position. I was going to wait for the moment when the full weight of what I knew could be placed on the table at once, without warning, with nothing left to maneuver around. The moment chose itself, as moments often do. It was a Saturday morning in late November, 3 days before Thanksgiving. Caden was at a friend's house until noon. Serena was in the kitchen with coffee, laptop open, ostensibly reviewing a client proposal. I had been up since 5:30, as I usually was on weekends, and I had spent an hour at the kitchen table across from her, doing nothing in particular, watching her work. At 9:15, she excused herself to take a call in the garage. I gave her 4 minutes. Then I went to my office, retrieved the folder I had brought home the previous evening, and carried it to the kitchen table. I poured myself a second cup of coffee. I sat down. When she came back in, still holding her phone, she stopped in the doorway. The folder was open on the table. The top page was the message about room 412 at the Fairlane. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. I said nothing. I picked up my coffee. "Owen," she said. "Sit down, Serena." She sat. She looked at the folder the way people look at something they've been dreading for a long time, not with surprise, but with the specific exhaustion of a person who has been waiting for a thing to happen and is now simply watching it happen. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Long enough," I said. "The messages go back to late September. The hotel charges go back further. The florist charge in October was interesting." She flinched at the florist. The small specific detail, which she hadn't expected me to find. "I want to explain," she said. "I know you do," I said. My voice was flat and entirely controlled. "I'm going to let you. But I want you to understand something first." I placed my hand on the folder. "I have all of it. Not part of it. All of it. Whatever version of this you're considering telling me, measure it against that." She looked at the table. Then she looked at me with something in her eyes that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance, something more complicated, something that had been building for a long time. "I know I have no right to ask you anything right now," she said. "But I need you to hear me. Not just the facts. What happened? How it happened. Can you give me that?" I looked at her for a long moment. "Talk," I said. She reached for her coffee mug, held it in both hands, and began. "I need to start before Derek. I need to start 2 years ago, because if I start with him it sounds like it's about him, and it isn't. Not really. 2 years ago I finished the Hargrove project, the one that took 11 months and won the regional award, and I came home the evening of the award dinner and you were on a call. You were on a call when I left, you were on a call when I got back, and I stood in the kitchen with this award in a little box and I didn't know what to do with it. So I put it in the cabinet above the refrigerator. It's still there. I'm not telling you that to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because that was the moment something shifted in how I understood our marriage. Not that you didn't love me. I knew you loved me. But I understood that night that I had become peripheral. That I existed in the life we'd built the way the furniture existed. Well chosen, well maintained, part of the design. Not the person you came home to. The backdrop. I kept working. I kept doing what I was good at. I kept telling myself it was enough, that a good marriage didn't need to be constantly tended, that what we had was solid and real and that solid and real was worth more than exciting. I believed that. I still believe parts of it. Derek came to me in August. He was easy to be around in a way that felt almost physical, not attracted to him, not at first, just relieved by him. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He remembered things I told him and asked about them the next time we spoke. It sounds so small. I know it sounds small. The first time anything crossed a line was in September. We were at the Leapers Fork property, the second one, and we'd been talking for hours and it got late and he said, "I think you're one of the most interesting people I've met in a long time," and I started crying. Not because he said something romantic. Because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had said something like that to me and meant it, and the fact that I couldn't remember, that's what broke something open. I crossed a line that evening. I knew it immediately afterward and I told myself it would be the only time. The lie I told myself was that I could contain it. That it was one moment of weakness and I would correct it and Owen would never need to know and nothing would need to change. I actually believed that. I want you to know that I am not a person who planned to deceive you. I became one, but I didn't start as one. What happened instead is that the containment failed because I didn't actually want to contain it, I wanted to feel the way I felt for a little longer. That's the honest truth. I was not swept away. I made a choice, and then I kept making it. The fear started in October. Not of you finding out, of who I was becoming. I would come home and sit in the car before I came inside because I needed the space between being there and being here, and I knew that was wrong, I knew what it meant, and I kept doing it anyway. The shame has a specific texture. You want to hear specific? I couldn't look at the photo on the bookcase, the one from Caden's 8th birthday, the three of us at the lake house. I turned it around in October and told Caden I was having it reframed. It's been face down for 6 weeks. He hasn't asked about it again. I tried to stop in early November. I told Derek it was over. He said he understood. We went 8 days without contact. And then you came home late on a Thursday and walked past the living room without looking up from your phone, and I was sitting there with a glass of wine and Caden's drawing spread across the coffee table, and I felt so completely alone in my own house that I went to the bathroom and texted Derek before I'd even consciously decided to. That's not an excuse. That's what happened. I want to fix this. I know I have no leverage to ask that. I know what I did and I know what it cost and I know you have every right to be done. But I am asking anyway, because I am not willing to be done, and I need you to know that before you decide anything. She stopped. The kitchen was quiet except for the furnace cycling on somewhere below us. I had not interrupted her once. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I picked up the folder, closed it, and set it on the counter beside me. I heard everything you said, I told her. I'm going to tell you what I know. Not what I feel, what I know. She watched me. I know the award is in the cabinet above the refrigerator. I know because I put it there, you left it on the counter when you went to bed and I put it somewhere safe. I should have said that at the time. I didn't. I looked at her steadily. I know that the photo being turned around is not about reframing. I know that you sat in the car on November 14th for 11 minutes before you came in. I know about the Fairlane. I know about 6 other occasions. She had gone very still. I also know, I said, that some of what you just told me is true. I was absent. I confused provision with presence. Those are real failures and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Her expression shifted, a fraction, an opening. What I am also not going to pretend, I said, is that any of that is a reason for what happened. Or that what happened is something I can move past. I stood up. I need you to understand that I'm not angry in the way you might expect. I'm not going to shout. I'm not going to throw things. But I need you to understand, very clearly, that this marriage is over. Owen. I'm going to ask you to stay in the guest room tonight. I'm going to talk to Caden tomorrow. And on Monday I'm going to call an attorney, not from my firm, someone outside, and we're going to begin the process. I picked up my coffee. I'm sorry it ended this way. I mean that. She was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, not grief, not panic, but something closer to the look of a person who has just understood that the negotiation they prepared for is not the conversation they're in. You decided this before today, she said quietly. Yes, I said. She absorbed that. Then she said, was anything these last 3 weeks real? When you held my hand and said you believed me. I believed that you meant what you said, I told her. I just understood what it was worth. I took my coffee and went upstairs. The divorce took 8 months. I had retained counsel within a week of the confrontation, a family law attorney in Nashville named Patricia, who was thorough and unemotional and exactly what the situation required. I had prepared well. The documentation of the affair, the financial irregularities on the business account, the hotel charges run through the business credit card, all of it was organized, time-stamped, and admissible. Serena's attorney was competent. It didn't matter. The preparation gap was too wide. The settlement was not punitive on my part, I want to be clear about that. I was not trying to destroy her. I was trying to be precise. The business account irregularities, nearly $14,000 in charges that had been run through the design practice over 4 months, were returned as part of the settlement. The business itself was valued and divided. The house was sold, we split the proceeds, and I kept the Franklin address by buying her out at an agreed figure that her attorney acknowledged was fair. Caden handled it the way 11-year-olds handle things that are too large to process in real time, by focusing on what was concrete. Which house on which nights? Whether the dog stayed with me. Whether he'd have to change schools. On all 3 counts the answer was favorable, and he accepted the rest with a kind of quiet stoicism that I recognized as hereditary and found, in equal measure, admirable and heartbreaking. Vince came over the week after Thanksgiving with a bottle of bourbon and the specific gift of not talking about it unless I brought it up. We sat in the living room and watched football and he said, once, "You doing okay?" And I said, "Getting there," and that was the full extent of it, which was exactly right. Brooke was less restrained. She called me the day after the confrontation and said, "I knew something was wrong at Whole Foods," and I said, "I know you did," and she said, "What do you need?" and I said, "Nothing right now. Later, maybe." She called every week for 3 months without fail, always briefly, always without pushing. That consistency was its own form of support. Serena and I spoke primarily through counsel after December. There were necessary exceptions: Caden's schedule, a school conference in February, the logistics of the house sale, and we managed those conversations with a civility that I believe came from the same place in both of us, the understanding that Caden was watching, and that how we treated each other now would shape something in him for a long time. She called me once, in March, outside the formal channels. I answered. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to know I'm not asking to reopen anything. I need to understand." "Ask," I said. "Did you ever consider trying? After I told you everything?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Yes," I said. For about 48 hours. I sat with the possibility and I looked at it from every angle. And I understood that what I was looking at was a marriage I would spend the next 20 years maintaining out of inertia and shared history. Not wanting to be wrong. Not wanting to be alone. Those are real things, but they're not reasons to stay. She was quiet for a moment. "I think I knew," she said, "when you said I know you do in the kitchen. That night I asked you to try. Something in your voice." "I'm sorry I said it that way," I said. "It wasn't kind." "It was honest," she said. That was something. We hung up. I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, smaller than the house, quieter, without the particular ambient sound of a family moving through rooms, and I looked at the counter where I'd put my keys and my phone and a cup of coffee, and I thought about the cabinet above the refrigerator in the Franklin house. I had gone back once to retrieve some files. The award was still there. I took it with me. It was sitting on the bookcase in my new apartment now, the Regional Design Award in its small presentation box, the one she'd won 11 months into a project and come home to find me on a call. I had put it there because it was hers and it mattered and someone should look at it. I didn't know if that was penance or just the right thing to do. I decided the distinction wasn't important. Caden came over for the first overnight in February and walked through the apartment with the same auditing seriousness he'd applied to every new space since he was small. He stopped at the bookcase. "Is that Mom's award?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. He looked at it for a moment. Then he nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd been thinking about, and moved on to the kitchen to negotiate snack options. I don't know what that nod meant exactly. But it felt like the right note to end on, a boy of 11 acknowledging, in the particular silent language of children, that his father had kept something worth keeping. Even when it cost him something. Even when everything else had changed. That is where I am now. Not arrived, not healed, further along than I expected to be, quieter than I thought I'd feel. The anger I anticipated carrying has mostly metabolized into something more like comprehension, of what I built, what I neglected, and what I would do differently. The list of what I'd do differently is honest and not short. But the award is on the bookcase. That part one got right. The most painful thing in this story is not the affair. It is the award sitting in a kitchen cabinet for 6 weeks, turning slowly irrelevant, while the woman who earned it concluded that she had become furniture in her own life. Owen is not a villain. He is something more common and more difficult to diagnose, a man who expressed love through results, financial security, a well-run household, a good school for their son, and genuinely believed that these expressions were sufficient. He was not wrong that they mattered. He was wrong that they were enough. The distinction cost him 14 years. What Serena did is not defensible. But it is explainable, which is a different thing, and the explanation lives in the specific collapse of identity that long-term marriages can produce in people who stop being named as individuals and become functions within a system. She was a talented designer who won awards that lived in cabinets. She was a mother, a hostess, a capable administrator of the domestic architecture Owen had funded but not fully occupied. Somewhere in the middle of all that usefulness, she stopped being a person to herself, and when Derek offered her the experience of being found interesting, she mistook the relief of that for something deeper and made catastrophic choices in pursuit of it. The reconciliation phase, the 3 weeks Owen spent watching and listening while Serena said she would do anything to fix things, is where the story turns most sharply psychological. Serena was not lying in the kitchen, reaching for his hand. She meant every word. She also spent those same 3 weeks still texting Derek from the driveway, which is the story's central and most honest irony. She wanted to save the marriage and continue the affair simultaneously, not out of simple selfishness, but because she had not yet resolved the internal question of which one she actually needed more. The reconciliation was real. It was also a delay tactic she had deployed against herself as much as against Owen. Owen's silent preparation, 3 weeks of evidence gathering while performing the role of the husband willing to work on things, is ethically complicated territory. There are moments where the audience might reasonably ask whether a man who truly wanted to save his marriage would have spent that time building a legal case instead. The answer, I think, is that Owen had already made his decision and was not consciously aware of it yet. The evidence gathering was not calculation. It was the professional reflex of a man who processes grief through documentation, who needed the full shape of the truth before he could allow himself to feel what it meant. That is neither dishonest nor cold. It is simply who he is, and who he had always been, and perhaps the deeper question is whether Serena had ever felt fully known by that version of him. The divorce was fair by any objective measure, and Owen's decision to keep the award on his bookcase is the story's most quietly significant gesture. It is not forgiveness, it is acknowledgement. He understood, finally, that she had been invisible in a house he'd built. He could not undo that. He could at least hold the evidence of what she'd been capable of, what she'd achieved in the years she'd spent making his life run smoothly. That small act of witness, arriving too late to save anything, is the truest thing he does in the story. What does this leave the audience with? Perhaps the question of what we express when we express love, and whether the people closest to us would recognize it as such. Owen expressed love as security. Serena needed to be seen. Neither of them said any of this out loud, for 14 years, and then a stranger in Leaper's Fork asked her one question and she started crying in a field. That is not a story about betrayal. That is a story about two people who stopped speaking a language the other one could hear, and ran out of time to learn it. What I keep returning to, honestly, is that award in the cabinet. Not the affair. Not the driveway texts. Not the hotel charges. That small box above the refrigerator, put away carefully by a man who meant well and retrieved by no one for 6 weeks. There's something in that detail that cuts deeper than any of the dramatic moments in this story. Because it wasn't cruelty. It was just absence. The kind of absence that wears the shape of a normal life. How many of us are doing that right now, without knowing it? Putting someone's achievement somewhere safe and forgetting to say I saw what you did, and it mattered. That's the question this story leaves me with. Not who was right and who was wrong. But what we're actually saying to the people we love, and whether they can hear it.